Welcome everyone. Tonight's story follows the Lewis and Clark expedition, a journey of over 8,000 miles across an unmapped continent. You'll hear about the treacherous mountain crossings, encounters with grizzly bears, and the generosity of Native American tribes. You'll learn about Sacagawea, who guided the expedition while carrying her infant son, and York, whose strength and skills were essential to their success. Get comfortable, let your breathing slow and relax. Now, close your eyes and let yourself drift back in time, more than 200 years ago, to a moment when the western half of North America remained a vast mystery to the young United States. Imagine a country that ended at the Mississippi River, beyond which lay an endless expanse of territory the American government considered unknown, though it was home to hundreds of thousands of Native Americans who had lived there for millennia. This is where our story begins, in the quiet contemplation of a president with an extraordinary vision that would forever change the lives of the people already living in those lands. Thomas Jefferson sat in his study, surrounded by maps that showed mostly blank spaces where the West should be. He had just completed the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen, acquiring over 800,000 square miles from France for $15 million. But purchasing land from France was a transaction between colonial powers that ignored the sovereignty of the native nations who actually inhabited and controlled these territories. Jefferson needed to know what lay in this vast territory, what rivers flowed through it, what mountains rose from its plains, whether there might be a water route all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and crucially, how the United States could establish dominance over the Native Americans who called it home. For this monumental task, Jefferson chose his personal secretary, a man he had known since childhood. Meriwether Lewis was born in 1774 in Virginia, not far from Jefferson's own Monticello. Lewis had grown up exploring the Virginia wilderness, developing an intimate knowledge of nature and survival. He had served in the military, rising to the rank of captain, and had proven himself capable, intelligent, and determined. Jefferson saw in Lewis the perfect combination of soldier, naturalist, and leader for what was, in essence, a military reconnaissance mission into lands already occupied by sovereign native nations. Lewis knew immediately that he could not undertake such a journey alone. He needed a co-captain, someone whose skills complemented his own, someone he could trust with his life. He chose William Clark, a man 4 years his senior who had been his commanding officer in the army. Clark was a skilled frontiersman, an excellent map-maker, and a natural leader of men. Clark also brought with him an enslaved man named York, who would prove indispensable to the expedition's success, though he would receive no official recognition or freedom for his contributions. Though the War Department only commissioned Clark as a lieutenant, Lewis insisted they would be co-captains in every meaningful way, sharing all decisions and responsibilities equally. The two men spent the winter of 1803 to 1804 in Camp Dubois, across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, preparing for their expedition. They recruited men carefully, looking for hunters, carpenters, blacksmiths, and soldiers who could handle the rigors of wilderness travel. They gathered supplies, weapons, ammunition, tools, medical supplies, gifts for the Native American tribes they would encounter, and scientific instruments for mapping and observation. They studied everything Jefferson could provide about the West, though in truth, very little reliable information existed in American archives, despite centuries of native knowledge about these lands. On May 14th, 1804, the Corps of Discovery finally set out from Camp Dubois. The party consisted of the 2 captains, 3 sergeants, 23 privates, Clark's enslaved man York, and Lewis's Newfoundland dog Seaman, along with several French boatmen who would travel only part way up the Missouri River. They travelled in a 55-foot keelboat and 2 smaller boats called pirogues, loaded with 21 bales of supplies and gifts. The Missouri River stretched before them, a vast brown highway cutting through the landscape. The current ran against them, making every mile a battle. The men pushed with poles, pulled with ropes from shore, and rowed until their hands bled. York worked as hard as any free man, standing watch, hunting, and rowing alongside the others, yet his labour was compulsory, not compensated beyond his basic sustenance. Some days they made 20 miles, other days barely 5. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and swarms of mosquitoes rose from the marshes in clouds so thick the men could barely breathe without inhaling them. As they travelled, they passed through lands inhabited by various Native American nations. Near present-day Council Bluffs in what is now Iowa, they held their first council with the Otoe and Missouri tribes. Lewis and Clark wore their military dress uniforms and distributed gifts, medals bearing Jefferson's image, American flags, certificates of friendship. They explained that the land now belonged to the United States, that the Spanish and French were gone, and that a new Great Father lived in Washington. They asked for peace and promised trade. The Native Americans listened politely, though they had heard such promises before from Europeans and had learned to be cautious. What the captains were describing was not a simple change in trading partners, but the beginning of an invasion. The Louisiana Purchase had been a transaction between colonial powers, with France selling land it did not truly control, and the United States buying territories inhabited by sovereign native nations who had never agreed to be ruled by any European power. These tribes had their own governments, their own laws, their own territories established over thousands of years. The American expedition represented the first wave of a transformation that would devastate their way of life. In August, the expedition suffered its only fatality of the entire journey. Sergeant Charles Floyd developed what was probably appendicitis, a condition no frontier medicine could cure. He died on August 20th, 1804, and was buried on a bluff overlooking the river near present-day Sioux City in what is now Iowa. The men mourned him deeply, then elected Patrick Gass to take his place as sergeant and continued their journey. As summer turned to autumn, the landscape began to change. The thick forests gave way to open prairies, where vast herds of buffalo grazed. The men saw their first prairie dogs, those curious little animals that lived in underground towns stretching for miles. They encountered pronghorn antelope, which could run faster than their horses could gallop. The West was revealing itself to be far more diverse and abundant with life than anyone in the American government had imagined, though Native Americans had lived in harmony with this abundance for countless generations. In late October, as winter approached, the expedition reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes near present-day Bismarck, in what is now North Dakota. These were not the small wandering bands they had encountered before, but permanent settlements of earth lodges housing thousands of people. The Mandans and Hidatsas were sophisticated traders, sitting at the center of a commercial network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. They had traded with European fur companies for decades and were skilled negotiators who understood their own power. Here, the court of discovery would spend the winter, building Fort Mandan and learning everything they could about the lands ahead. The expedition's survival would depend entirely on the generosity and knowledge of these native nations. It was during this winter that two of the most important members of the expedition joined them. Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader, offered his services as an interpreter. He had two young Shoshone wives, both captured from the people years earlier in violent raids. One of these wives, Sacagawea, was only about 16 years old and pregnant. Clark wrote her name as Janie in his journals, though history would remember her by a name meaning bird woman. Lewis and Clark hired Charbonneau primarily to gain access to Sacagawea, whose knowledge of the Western Territories and ability to communicate with tribes along the route would prove far more valuable than her husband's contributions. The winter was brutally cold, with temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero. The Missouri River froze solid, with ice several feet thick. The men hunted buffalo and elk, smoked meat, made moccasins, and repaired equipment. Lewis spent his time interviewing traders and Native Americans about the route ahead, drawing maps and recording everything he learned in his journals. Clark made astronomical observations and refined his maps. They learned that the Rocky Mountains were not a single ridge that could be crossed in a day, as Jefferson had hoped, but a vast, complex range that would require weeks to traverse. Without the detailed geographical knowledge shared by the Mandan and Hidatsa people, the expedition would likely have failed before even reaching the mountains. On February 11th, 1805, in the bitter cold of a North Dakota winter, Sacagawea gave birth to a son. The labor was difficult and prolonged. Lewis, acting as midwife, gave her a potion made from rattlesnake rattle, a remedy suggested by a French trader, and shortly after she delivered a healthy baby boy. The baby was named Jean-Baptiste, though Clark nicknamed him Pomp or Pompey, and would grow fond of the child, eventually offering to raise and educate him. When the expedition departed Fort Mandan on April 7th, 1805, this infant, barely 2 months old, would make the entire journey to the Pacific Ocean and back, strapped to his mother's back. Sacagawea would carry him through mountain passes, across raging rivers, and over thousands of miles of wilderness, all while serving as translator, diplomat, guide, and gatherer of essential food and medicine. And the permanent party that left Fort Mandan numbered 33 people, including the baby. They sent the keelboat back to St. Louis with reports, maps, and specimens for Jefferson, including a live prairie dog and 4 magpies. From here on, they would travel in the pirogues and newly constructed canoes, heading into territory no American citizen had ever seen, though every mile was known intimately by the Native Americans who lived there. The character of the land continued to change as they moved west. The plains opened wider, the sky seemed to stretch forever, and the wildlife became even more abundant and unfamiliar. They encountered massive grizzly bears, which Native American tribes had warned them about. These bears were nothing like the black bears of the East. They were enormous, weighing up to half a ton, and fearless. When shot, they would charge rather than flee. The men learned quickly to hunt grizzlies in groups and to climb trees when possible, though the bears could climb too. York proved himself a skilled hunter and became legendary among the native tribes they encountered. York's physical strength, his skill with weapons, and his confident bearing commanded respect. He performed feats of strength that amazed native audiences and helped establish the expedition's credibility. In June, they reached a fork in the Missouri River in what is now Montana and faced their first major decision: which branch was the true Missouri. The North Fork was wider and more turbulent, muddy and shallow. Most of the men believed this was the Missouri, but Lewis and Clark, after scouting both branches, believed the South Fork was correct. It ran clearer and deeper, coming from the direction of the mountains they needed to cross. They named the North Fork the Marias River and followed their intuition, taking the South Fork. It was the right choice, though they wouldn't know for certain until they reached the Great Falls of the Missouri, which the Hidatsas had described to them. On June 13th, 1805, Lewis, scouting ahead in Montana, heard a distant roar. He climbed a rise and saw before him one of the most spectacular sights of the journey, the Great Falls of the Missouri. Water cascaded over a series of 5 falls, the largest dropping over 80 feet. The spray created perpetual rainbows in the sunlight. It was beautiful, but it was also an obstacle. They would have to portage their canoes, equipment, and supplies around the falls. The portage took nearly a month of back-breaking labour. The distance was 18 miles over rough terrain of sharp rocks and prickly pear cacti that pierced through the men's moccasins. They constructed crude wagons from cottonwood trees, loading the canoes on them and dragging them across the landscape. York pulled his full weight and more, his strength essential to moving the heavy loads. The summer sun was merciless, temperatures soaring over 100 degrees. Violent thunderstorms struck with little warning, with hailstones as large as apples, bruising the men and threatening to crush their boats. But they persevered, and by mid-July they were back on the river. As they continued west, the Rocky Mountains began to loom on the horizon, growing larger with each passing day. Sacagawea began recognizing landmarks from her childhood, which filled her with a mixture of anticipation and profound sadness. She had been captured near these lands 5 years earlier during a raid by the Hidatsa, taken from her people, the Lemhi Shoshone, when she was just 11 years old. She'd been kidnapped, enslaved, and eventually claimed as a wife by Charbonneau. Now she was returning to the homeland from which she had been violently torn, carrying her infant son and serving as guide to the very forces that would ultimately destroy her people's independence. Yet she performed her duties with grace and courage, never wavering, even as she must have understood what American expansion would mean for native nations. Lewis, scouting ahead on foot in what is now Idaho, was desperate to find the Shoshone. The expedition needed horses to cross the mountains, and the Shoshone were known to have horses. Without them, the Corps of Discovery might not be able to continue. In August, after days of searching, Lewis finally encountered a Shoshone scouting party. Through signs and gestures, he convinced them he came in peace and that he had a Shoshone woman with his party. The Shoshone led Lewis back to their main camp, where he met their chief, Kamiawait. When the rest of the expedition arrived with Sacagawea, an extraordinary reunion took place. As Sacagawea began interpreting, translating from Shoshone to Hidatsa to French to English in a chain that required multiple people, she suddenly realized she was speaking to her own brother. Camawait was her older brother, from whom she had been separated 5 years earlier when she was captured. She wept and ran to embrace him, throwing her blanket over them both in the Shoshone way. It was an emotional moment that moved even the tough frontiersman to tears. Sacagawea learned that most of her family was dead, killed in raids or by disease. Her people were struggling, constantly under threat from better armed tribes, starving during harsh winters, and now facing the prospect of American encroachment. Yet despite her personal grief and the precarious position of her people, Sacagawea used her influence to help the expedition negotiate for horses and a guide. She translated complex negotiations, advocated for the expedition's needs, and helped establish trust between the two parties. Without her intervention and her family connection, the expedition might well have failed at this critical juncture. The Shoshone had every reason to refuse to help or even to eliminate this advance party of American invaders, but Sacagawea's presence and advocacy made the difference. This fortunate connection helped the expedition negotiate for 29 horses and a guide, an elderly Shoshone man named Old Toby. The Shoshone were generous, though they had little to spare. They told Lewis and Clark that the route ahead was extremely difficult, that the mountains were vast and the rivers unnavigable. They shared this knowledge even as they must have understood that they were helping to map a route for the invasion of their world. With the horses and Old Toby's knowledge, the expedition headed into the Bitterroot Mountains in September 1805. The crossing of the Bitterroot Range, which spans modern-day Idaho and Montana, was the most difficult ordeal of the entire journey. The trail was steep and narrow, often barely visible, winding along cliff edges, where a single misstep could send a horse tumbling hundreds of feet. Snow began falling in early September, unusual even for these high elevations. The men were not prepared for winter conditions. They had little food, as game was scarce in the high mountains. They were reduced to eating their horses, then candles, then portable soup, a concentrated broth that Lewis had brought, but which everyone found nearly inedible. For 11 days, they struggled through the snow-covered mountains, growing weaker each day. Clark wrote in his journal that they were wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Several men developed dysentery. The horses stumbled and fell on the icy trails. Sacagawea, carrying baby Jean-Baptiste on her back, navigated the treacherous mountain trails without complaint, gathering whatever edible roots and berries she could find to supplement their meagre rations. She dug for camas roots when possible, sharing her knowledge of which plants could sustain them. Hope was fading when on September 20th, Clark, scouting ahead, emerged from the mountains into what is now Idaho and saw in the distance the prairies of the Columbia River Plateau. He had found the way down. They descended to the territory of the Nez Perce, who lived along the Clearwater River in present-day Idaho. The Nez Perce, despite having limited contact with white men, treated the starving expedition with remarkable kindness. They fed them dried salmon and camas root, though the sudden change in diet made most of the men violently ill for days. The Nez Perce could easily have killed the entire expedition in their weakened state and taken all their weapons and supplies. Some Nez Perce warriors argued for doing exactly that, recognizing the threat these explorers represented to their way of life. but an elderly Nez Perce woman named Wakawais, who had been captured by another tribe years earlier and treated kindly by white traders before escaping home, advocated for the expedition's safety. "These are the people who helped me," she told her people. "Do them no hurt." Her intervention here had saved the entire expedition. The Nez Perce's hospitality extended beyond simply feeding the starving men. They taught the expedition how to build canoes using the burn and scrape method, helped them prepare for river travel, and agreed to care for their horses until they returned. This act of trust and generosity would prove crucial. The expedition left their horses with the Nez Perce, promising to retrieve them on their return journey, and began building canoes for the water route to the Pacific. By early October, they were back on the water, traveling down the Clearwater River to the Snake River, then to the mighty Columbia, which flows through Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. The Columbia was unlike any river they had traveled before. It was enormous, and it was heading west toward the ocean. The current, for the first time in more than a year, was with them, but the Columbia had its own dangers. Massive rapids churned between narrow rock channels. The men had to carefully navigate or portage around falls like Cellulo Falls, a thundering cascade where tons of water plunged through a narrow gap in the basalt rock. Cellulo Falls was a sacred place for Native Americans and had been a major fishing and trading center for thousands of years, where different tribes gathered annually to catch salmon and trade. The expedition was passing through landscapes that held deep spiritual and cultural meaning for the people who lived there. As they descended the Columbia through Washington and Oregon, the landscape transformed once again. The dry plains gave way to dense forests. Massive cedar and fir trees towered overhead, their trunks wider than the canoes were long. Rain began falling, a gentle mist at first, then steady downpours that would continue for weeks. They were entering the temperate rainforest of the Pacific Northwest. They also began encountering more Native American tribes, the Yakima, Umatilla, Walla Walla, Wishram, and Chinook. These nations were wealthy and sophisticated, living in permanent villages, trading extensively along the river. The Chinook were master traders who drove hard bargains and knew exactly how much every item was worth. They had already encountered European and American trading ships that came to the coast, so the expedition was not the first white men they had seen. The Chinook had been trading with European and American ships for years, and understood all too well what increased contact with white civilization could mean. They had already experienced devastating smallpox epidemics, introduced by earlier European contact, which had killed perhaps 30% of their population in recent decades. They watched this new American expedition with wary eyes, knowing it represented a potential threat to their autonomy and way of life. On November 7th, 1805, Clark wrote in his journal what would become one of the most famous entries of the expedition, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." They could see the wide expanse of the Columbia estuary opening to the sea. Though they were actually still about 20 miles from the open ocean, the Pacific was within reach. After 18 months and some 4,000 miles of travel, they had crossed the continent, following routes and receiving help from Native Americans every step of the way. But reaching the Pacific in November meant spending winter on the coast, and they needed to choose a location for winter camp. They put it to a vote, remarkably democratic for 1805. Every member of the party voted, including York, Clark's enslaved man, and Sacagawea, a woman and a Native American. This may have been one of the first times in American history that a black man and a Native American woman were included in an official vote. York cast his vote as a full member of the expedition. His opinion counted equally with the others. Sacagawea voted for a location where she might find Wapato roots, demonstrating her practical knowledge of food sources. Yet despite this moment of democracy, York would return to St. Louis still enslaved, his years of service and equal participation counting for nothing in the eyes of the law. They chose a location on the south side of the Columbia Estuary in present-day Oregon and built Fort Clatsop, named after the local Clatsop tribe. The winter of 1805 to 1806 was miserable. It rained almost constantly. In the entire winter, they saw only 12 days without rain and only 6 days of sunshine. Everything was damp and mouldy. Fleas infested their clothing and bedding. Elk meat, which they ate constantly, spoiled quickly in the humidity. The men were depressed, sick, and bored. Lewis spent his time writing detailed descriptions of the plants, animals, and Native Americans they had encountered. His journal entries from this winter show his keen scientific mind at work, describing everything from the life cycle of salmon to the different varieties of ferns growing in the forest. Clark updated his maps and calculated their position. Sacagawea made clothing from elk hides for the entire party, her skills with leather and sewing, keeping the men warm and dry. She also continued to gather food, finding wapato roots and other edibles that supplemented their monotonous diet. York hunted and stood watch, his contributions as essential as any free man's, though he received no recognition beyond basic sustenance. The men boiled seawater to make salt, which they desperately needed to preserve their food for the return journey. December, some of the Clatsop reported that a whale had washed up on the beach about 20 miles south along the Oregon coast. Sacagawea insisted on going to see it, declaring that she had travelled all this way and would not be denied the chance to see the great waters and this marvel. It was one of the few times she asserted herself in the journals, and her determination prevailed. Clark wrote that she had been very importunate to be allowed to go, insisting that she had travelled a long way with us to see the great waters, and now that that monstrous fish was also to be seen, she thought it very hard that she could not be permitted to see either. Her desire to experience these wonders, despite all the hardships she had endured, speaks to her curiosity and spirit. They made the journey, and though by the time they arrived, the local Tillamook tribe had already stripped most of the meat from the skeleton, they were able to purchase some whale blubber and oil, which provided a welcome change in their diet. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the expedition prepared for the return journey. They were eager to leave, to escape the constant rain and return to their families. On March 23rd, 1806, they departed Fort Clatsop in Oregon, leaving it as a gift to the Clatsop, along with a note detailing their journey in case any trading ships came looking for them. The journey up the Columbia was harder than the journey down had been. They were travelling against the current now, and the river was swollen with spring snowmelt. The rapids that had been thrilling on the way down were terrifying on the way up. They had to line the canoes up using ropes, with men on shore hauling while others in the canoes kept them from capsizing. York's strength was crucial during this arduous work. pulling ropes and steadying boats with power that few others could match. It was exhausting work, made worse by the fact that their food supply was running low. Game was scarce, and the Columbia River tribes, who had seemed generous before, now demanded high prices for their dried fish. These tribes were experiencing their own hardships, and they recognized that helping this American expedition ultimately worked against their own interests. By late April, they had reached the territory of the Nez Perce again, but the snow was still too deep in the mountains to attempt a crossing. They had to wait until early June, camping with the Nez Perce and growing increasingly frustrated with the delay. The Nez Perce returned their horses, honouring their promise despite the passage of many months and the valuable property these animals represented. When the expedition finally did attempt to cross in mid-June, they found the snow still dangerously deep. They had to turn back and wait for Nez Perce guides to lead them across. Finally, on June 24th, with Nez Perce guides, they crossed the Bitterroot Mountains between Idaho and Montana, completing in 6 days what had taken them 11 agonizing days the previous fall. The guides knew every turn and twist of the trail, every place where food and water could be found. It was a stark reminder of how much the expedition depended on native knowledge for their success. Without Native American help at every stage, the Corps of Discovery would have certainly failed. On the western side of the Continental Divide, at a place called Travelers Rest in present-day Montana, the captains made a bold decision. They would split the party to explore more territory. Lewis would take a group north to explore the Marias River, hoping it might extend far enough north to improve the northern boundary claims of the United States. Clark would take the larger group south and east to explore the Yellowstone River, and York would accompany Clark's party. They would reunite where the Yellowstone met the Missouri. Lewis's exploration of the Marias River in Montana would lead to the only violent encounter of the entire expedition. On July 26, 1806, Lewis and his small party of 3 men encountered 8 young Blackfeet warriors. They camped together, but in the night the Blackfeet attempted to steal the expedition's guns and horses. The Blackfeet were not thieves acting out of greed. They were members of a nation defending their territory against foreign invaders who were mapping their lands for future American expansion. In the confrontation that followed, 2 Blackfeet men were killed, the only Native American deaths directly caused by the expedition. Lewis and his men fled, riding over 100 miles in 24 hours to escape potential retaliation, not stopping until they reached the Missouri River where they had hidden canoes. This violent encounter was a harbinger of the conflicts to come between the United States and the Plains tribes. Meanwhile, Clark's party had been moving smoothly down the Yellowstone River through Montana. They traveled through land of spectacular rock formations and abundant game. York continued to serve as hunter, laborer, and watchman. Clark carved his name and the date on a sandstone outcropping called Pompey's Pillar in present-day Montana, naming it after Sacagawea's son, whom he had grown to love. It is the only remaining physical evidence of the expedition's passage that can still be seen today. The 2 parties reunited as planned on August 12th, 1806, at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers in present-day North Dakota. From there, it was a race downstream with the current, covering as much as 70 miles in a single day. The men were eager to get home, to see family and friends, to sleep in real beds and eat real food. They had been gone for over 2 years, and many people in the East had given them up for dead. On September 23rd, 1806, the expedition arrived in St. Louis, Missouri, to the astonishment of its citizens. Cannons fired in celebration. People crowded the riverbank to see the men who had returned from the dead, who had crossed the continent and come back to tell the tale. The Corps of Discovery had been gone for 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days. They had travelled roughly 8,000 miles. The expedition brought back an extraordinary wealth of information. Lewis and Clark had documented 178 new plant species and 122 new animal species. Though Native Americans had known about these plants and animals for thousands of years, they produced 140 maps of the territory. They established contact with dozens of Native American tribes and recorded detailed observations of their languages, customs, and ways of life. They proved there was no easy water route across the continent, but they had mapped a viable path that others could follow, opening the way for American expansion. The men of the expedition received their pay and land grants and returned to their lives. Some became farmers, others continued as soldiers. York, Clark's enslaved man, who had stood watch and voted alongside everyone else on the journey, who had hunted and hauled and risked his life countless times, was not immediately freed by Clark. York asked for his freedom, requested to live near his wife, who was enslaved by another master in Kentucky, but Clark initially refused. For several years, Clark hired York out to other masters as punishment for his requests for freedom. Eventually, likely around 1811, Clark did free York, but grudgingly and without the gratitude such service deserved. Some accounts suggest York started a freight hauling business, though the details of his later life remain unclear. The relationship between Clark and York, which had seemed almost equal on the expedition, reverted to the harsh reality of enslavement once they returned to civilization. York's story reminds us that even as the expedition was mapping territory and expanding American freedom, that freedom was never extended equally to all. Sacagawea and Charbonneau left the expedition at the Mandan villages in North Dakota on the return journey. Clark, who had grown fond of little Jean-Baptiste, offered to adopt and educate the boy. Sacagawea and Charbonneau eventually took Clark up on his offer when the boy was 6 years old, leaving Jean-Baptiste with Clark, who enrolled him in school and later paid for him to travel to Europe. Jean-Baptiste became an educated man who spoke multiple languages and traveled the world, eventually returning to the American West as a guide and mountain man. As for Sacagawea herself, the historical record becomes unclear. Some sources suggest she died of fever in 1812 at Fort Manuel, in what is now South Dakota, only 24 or 25 years old. Other sources, particularly oral histories from the Shoshone people, claim she lived until 1884 on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, where she was known as Parivo, or Chief Woman, and lived to old age surrounded by adopted children. The uncertainty itself is telling, reflecting how little value American society placed on documenting the life of a Native American woman, even one who had contributed so much to the nation's expansion. Whichever account is true, Sacagawea never received any payment or recognition from the United States government for her invaluable service. She was not mentioned in the official reports, and her contributions were largely forgotten for nearly a century after the expedition. William Clark went on to have a distinguished career. He became the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Western Territories and the Governor of the Missouri Territory. In these roles, he negotiated treaties that stripped native tribes of their lands, participating in the very dispossession that the expedition had set in motion. He married and had several children, naming his firstborn son Meriwether Lewis Clark. He kept journals and papers from the expedition and worked to see them published. He maintained relationships with many Native American leaders he had met on the journey, though these relationships could not prevent the devastating policies he administered. Clark died in 1838 at the age of 68, surrounded by family, his role in opening the West for American expansion secured in history. Meriwether Lewis's fate was far more tragic. Jefferson appointed him governor of Louisiana Territory, a position for which Lewis was ill-suited. He was a naturalist and explorer, not a politician. He struggled with the administrative duties and faced criticism and political opposition. He had always been prone to periods of depression, what he called his hypochondria, and the stress of his position made it worse. He drank heavily and may have been taking laudanum, a common opium-based medicine of the era. In the fall of 1809, travelling to Washington to defend himself against charges of mismanaging funds, he died under mysterious circumstances at an inn called Grinder's Stand on the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. He was only 35 years old. The official verdict was suicide, and Lewis's behaviour in the days before his death suggested he was in deep psychological distress. But the circumstances were suspicious enough that some historians have argued he was murdered. The truth will likely never be known. What is certain is that one of America's greatest explorers died young and far from home, never having seen his journals properly published or his scientific discoveries properly credited. The legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition extends far beyond the achievements of the two captains. It opened the West to American expansion for better and worse, but primarily worse for the Native Americans already living there. The detailed maps and reports brought back by the expedition encouraged thousands of Americans to head west. First fur trappers and traders, then missionaries, then settlers. This wave of expansion would have devastating consequences for the Native Americans who had lived in those lands for thousands of years. The expedition encountered dozens of Native American tribes, and Lewis and Clark's journals provide invaluable records of these cultures at a moment before they were transformed and largely destroyed by American expansion. Within a few decades of the expedition's return, many of the tribes they encountered would be decimated by disease, displaced from their lands, or destroyed by warfare. The Mandans and Hidatsas, who had saved the expedition during that first winter, were nearly wiped out by a smallpox epidemic in 1837 that killed 90% of the Mandan people. The Nez Perce, who had shown such generous hospitality, were forcibly removed from their lands in 1877 and pursued by the US Army in a desperate flight toward Canada. The buffalo herds that seemed infinite would be hunted nearly to extinction in a deliberate policy to destroy the Plains tribe's way of life. The balance of life that had existed for centuries would be shattered. The expedition itself was just the beginning. It was the reconnaissance mission that made conquest possible. The journals documented not just geography and wildlife, but also the military strength, political organization, and resources of native nations. information that would later be used to subjugate them. The expedition established American claims to territory and set in motion a series of policies, from the Indian Removal Act to the reservation system that would devastate native communities forever. The journals kept by Lewis and Clark, and to a lesser extent by other members of the expedition, provide an irreplaceable window into early 19th century America and the West before American settlement. Clark's spelling was phonetic and idiosyncratic, writing mosquitoes as muscators and recording what he heard rather than what was correct. Lewis's prose was more polished but filled with scientific terminology and careful observation. Together, their journals run to thousands of pages, recording everything from the taste of beaver tail to the exact angle of a river bend to the ceremony of a Mandan religious ritual. The expedition was not the first to cross North America. Fur traders and Native Americans had been crossing the continent for centuries along various routes. Alexander Mackenzie, a Canadian explorer, had reached the Pacific overland in 1793, 13 years before Lewis and Clark. Spanish expeditions had explored extensively in the southwest. Russian traders had established settlements on the Pacific coast of what is now Alaska. Native Americans had trade routes that spanned the continent, and individuals had traveled coast to coast long before any European thought to attempt it. What made Lewis and Clark's expedition significant was not that it was first, but that it was comprehensive, well documented, and backed by the power of an expanding nation. It was a scientific expedition as much as an exploratory one, carefully recording everything encountered. It was also a political expedition, claiming territory for the United States and establishing American presence in the West, and it was, in the end, a story of remarkable human achievement and terrible historical consequence, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things through determination, cooperation, and courage, while simultaneously setting in motion events that would devastate entire civilizations. The Corps of Discovery faced death many times. They could have died from exposure in the mountains, drowned in rapids, been killed by grizzly bears or hostile tribes, or succumbed to disease or starvation. That they lost only one man in over 2 years of wilderness travel, and that death was from a condition that would have killed him anywhere, speaks to their skill, luck, and the help they received from Native American tribes along the way. Without the Mandans sheltering them through winter, without the Shoshone providing horses, without the Nez Perce saving them from starvation and guiding them through the mountains, without Sacagawea's translation and diplomacy, without York's strength and skill, the expedition would have failed. Consider what they accomplished with the technology of their time. They had no radios or GPS, no weather forecast, no accurate maps of where they were going. They navigated by compass, sextant, and dead reckoning, making astronomical observations to determine their position. They preserved food by smoking and drying, travelled by muscle power alone, and treated injuries and illnesses with the limited medical knowledge of the early 19th century. They carried everything they needed on their backs or in their boats. The physical endurance required was extraordinary. They paddled and poled boats against strong currents for hours each day. They carried heavy loads across mountains and portages. They hunted for their food, which meant tracking and killing large animals, then butchering and preserving the meat. They made their own clothing and repaired their equipment. They stood watch through cold nights and marched through heat and rain. and they did this day after day, month after month, for over 2 years. The psychological challenge was equally daunting. They were cut off from all contact with home, with no way to send or receive messages. They didn't know if they would ever return or if they would find what they were looking for. They faced the unknown each day, never certain what lay around the next river bend or over the next mountain ridge. The men had to trust their leaders and each other completely, knowing their survival depended on cooperation and discipline. It's through it all, morale remained generally high. There were disputes and discipline problems, but no desertions after the journey truly began. The men took pride in their mission and in each other. They celebrated holidays together, with the 4th of July and Christmas marked by special meals and toasts when possible. They named geographical features after each other and after loved ones back home. They developed their own shared culture and identity as the core of discovery. The expedition's success was built on the skills and knowledge of many people, most of whom will never be fully recognized by history. The French-Canadian boatmen who helped them up the Missouri in the first season, the Native American guides who showed them the way through the mountains, the Native American women who taught them which plants were edible and which could cure illnesses, the hunters who kept the party, fed the carpenters who built their boats and forts. Every member of the expedition contributed something essential. Even Seaman, Lewis's Newfoundland dog, played a role. The dog stood watch, barking alerts when bears or buffalo came near the camp. He retrieved game shot in the water and kept Lewis company during lonely watches. Native American tribes they encountered were fascinated by Seaman, many having never seen such a large dog before. Lewis was devoted to the animal, and though Seaman disappears from the journals before the expedition's end, it is believed he made it back to St. Louis with his master. In the final accounting, what did the Lewis and Clark expedition achieve? It mapped a route across the continent, though not the easy water passage Jefferson had hoped for. It gathered an immense amount of scientific data about the flora, fauna, and geography of the West. It established diplomatic contact with numerous Native American tribes, though these relationships would later be betrayed by American expansion and broken treaties. It demonstrated that the journey was possible, encouraging others to follow, and it gave America a story, an epic of exploration and discovery that captured the imagination of the young nation, whilst simultaneously beginning a dark chapter in the story of a Native American. The story of Lewis and Clark has been told and retold countless times in books, films, and documentaries. It has been celebrated and criticized, romanticized, and re-evaluated. Modern historians have worked to give more credit to Sacagawea, York, and the Native Americans who made the expedition possible. They have examined the expedition's role in the colonization and dispossession of Native American lands. They have looked more critically at the personalities of Lewis and Clark themselves, seeing them as complex, flawed human beings rather than simple heroes. They have recognized that this story of American triumph is inseparable from the story of Native American tragedy. But whatever lens we view it through, the journey remains remarkable. Two men and their companions travelled into lands unknown to them and returned to tell the tale. They saw landscapes and things no American citizen had seen before. They endured hardships that would break most people and kept moving forward. They produced a record of their journey that remains valuable more than 2 centuries later. They opened a chapter in American history that would shape the nation for generations to come, for better and for worse. We must hold both truths simultaneously. The expedition was an extraordinary achievement of human endurance, cooperation, and exploration, and it was also the beginning of catastrophic loss for the Native Americans of the West. Sacagawea was a heroic figure who saved the expedition multiple times while carrying her infant son, and she was also a young woman caught between worlds, helping to map the route that would destroy her people's way of life. York was a skilled and essential member of the corps who performed with courage and ability equal to any free man, yet he was denied the freedom he earned. The native tribes were generous hosts who shared their knowledge and resources, and they were soon overwhelmed by the invasion their hospitality had facilitated. These contradictions are at the heart of American history. The same journey that represents ingenuity and achievement also represents displacement and destruction. The opening of the West meant opportunity for some and catastrophe for others. Understanding the Lewis and Clark expedition in its full complexity means acknowledging both what was gained and what was lost, honoring the courage of all who participated while recognizing the terrible cost paid by those who had no choice in the matter. As you drift towards sleep, imagine that journey unfolding across the map of America. See the boats pushing up the Missouri River through what would become South Dakota and North Dakota, struggling against the current. See the expedition marching across the prairies of Montana, surrounded by herds of buffalo that would soon vanish. See them climbing into the mountains of Idaho and Montana, leading their horses up narrow trails with cliffs dropping away on both sides. See Sacagawea carrying baby Jean-Baptiste through the snow, gathering roots to feed hungry men. See York pulling ropes and steadying boats with his great strength, his contributions essential but unrecognized. See them in their canoes on the Columbia through Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, shooting rapids and navigating through fog toward the Pacific. See them huddled in Fort Clatsop in Oregon, enduring rain and dreaming of home. See them racing downstream on the return journey, eager to tell their story. Think of the stars they slept under, the same stars you can see tonight if you look up. Think of the rivers they travelled, still flowing today along much the same paths. Think of the mountains they crossed, still standing tall and snow-capped. The land they saw has changed, but traces remain. You can still stand at the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers in North Dakota where the expedition reunited. You can still hike trails through the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho and Montana. You can still see Pompey's Pillar in Montana with Clark's carved signature, named for the baby boy who travelled thousands of miles on his mother's back. Think of the Native Americans who helped them, who fed them, guided them, and taught them. Remember the Mandan and Hidatsa who sheltered them through brutal winter. Remember the Shoshone who gave them horses when they had none to spare. Remember the Nez Perce who saved them from starvation and honoured their promise to care for the horses. Remember Sacagawea, whose knowledge, courage, and diplomacy made the difference between success and failure. Remember York, whose strength and skill were essential to the journey, but whose freedom was denied. Remember all those whose names we don't know, who contributed to this story in ways both large and small. Let the story carry you now into sleep, down the rivers and across the plains and over the mountains, into the peaceful darkness of rest. The journey is complete. The explorers have come home. The consequences of their journey ripple through history, and shape the nation we live in today. The full story, with all its triumphs and tragedies, its heroes and victims, its discoveries and destructions, has been told. Sleep well and dream of distant horizons. Dream of young Sacagawea carrying her baby across a continent. Dream of York standing watch under western stars, equal in all but law. Dream of those who lived in these lands for thousands of years before the first explorer arrived, and who persist today despite everything. Dream of a past that was more complicated than we sometimes remember, and a future where we might learn from that complexity. The rivers still flow, the mountains still stand, the stars still shine, and the story, in all its difficult beauty, continues to teach us if we're willing to listen. Rest now, knowing that history is not just dates and names and places, but the lives of real people who laughed and cried and struggled and persevered, who made choices both brave and terrible, who shaped the world we inherited. May your dreams be as vast as the western plains, as deep as the mountain passes, as endless as the Pacific horizon. The core of discovery sleeps in history, but their story lives on, a reminder of what we can achieve together and what we must never forget we lost along the way. Sleep well, and good night.